it says in the contract that the buyer is to receive a copy of the title commitment 5 days before closing on a cash transaction and 15 days before closing if it's a mortgage transaction. So if you're representing the buyer, you want to make sure that your buyer is receiving that title commitment. And I'm going to tell you why in a few minutes. In addition to that, and I'm not sure if all of you are aware, there is a condition within the contract that the seller must deliver a copy of his previous owner's policy within 5 days of the effective date to both the buyer and the settlement agent. We don't see this happen as a rule. We see a seller who knows they're going to get a reissue rate credit because it's less than 3 years old, provide their policy. But the contract itself says that the seller must provide a copy of his previous owner's policy to both the buyer and the settlement agent within 5 days of the effective date. I will tell you that we have seen buyers get out of the contract because that didn't happen. And here is a scenario for you. And I'm going to tell you a lot of stories because that's what people remember. The stories are all true. I always change the names to protect the guilty. But we had a situation where the seller did not provide his owner's policy. There were some title issues, and the title agent said, well, you know, if we get the old policy, maybe we'll be able to get this closed. And all of a sudden, the seller produced it. Meanwhile, the buyer was getting cold feet. And when the seller produced it finally at past the 5 days, the buyer went back and said, well, you know what, I'm going to cancel the contract because you didn't provide the old owner's policy that you actually had. And the buyer was able to get out of the contract. So really important that you remember the buyers to get the commitment ahead of time, and the seller is to provide the policy within 5 days of the effective date. So if you're representing a seller, get that from them when you go take the listing. So let's go to the next one, Chris, which should be the FAR contract title standards.
Moving right along, and Sue, I'll just kind of stop. I'll definitely kind of move along with you. So if I'll make sure to pay attention to every minute.
That's a good idea.
So
that's a good idea.
So you'll be good. So
as
you switch, I'll switch with you. So
perfect. So when we talk about title standards, okay, everybody who obtains an owner's policy of title insurance receives what we call insurable title. But title is subject to exceptions as recited in the title commitment and further in the owner's title policy. Marketable title addresses those issues which will remain with the property as shown above. So what do we show? If you look at the title standards, and this is in both the contracts, it's standard A, 1 and 2, it says the buyer will accept property knowing what the comprehensive land use plan, zoning, and land use restrictions are, the restrictions and matters appearing on the plat, oil, gas, and mineral rights of record, unplatted public utility easements of record, taxes, and assumed mortgages. So let's talk about what might be marketable or unmarketable to someone. So I always use my own home, and my home sits within a planned unit development, so I have building and use restrictions. My home backs up to the conservation area and a beautiful lakefront. It's really a stinky retention pond, but whatever. My restrictions say because of where I live within the community, I cannot put up a fence because I cannot restrict the view from my neighbors of those lovely surroundings. So if you had a buyer and your buyer had 2 small children and they wanted to have a property where they could put up a fence, because really they didn't want their kids to wander by the lake, get eaten by an alligator, and dragged into the conservation area where my husband is sure that Bigfoot lives. my home would not be marketable to that buyer. It's insurable, but it's not marketable because they can't do with it what they want. Now, if your buyer doesn't have any small children, doesn't care if they put up a fence, that home is perfectly, marketable to them. So why would the buyer then want the seller's owner's policy right away? Okay, because whatever those exceptions are that are going to be shown on the new commitment are going to be the exceptions that were shown on that existing owner's policy. So by getting that owner's policy right away, your buyer can determine whether or not the property is marketable to them. So think about that. Would you want your buyer to know right away, within 5 days of the acceptance of the offer, if they're going to have an issue? Or would you want to find out at the very last minute that the buyer says, you know what, I'm not buying this property because it's not marketable to me? So exceptions are important, and keep that in mind because we're going to talk about that when we go through the commitment itself. All right, let's go to the next page. If we could, Chris, about title standards, standard A2. So under the cure period, standard A2, the buyer has 5 days after they actually receive the commitment to notify the seller in writing any specified defects they have. And then the seller has 30 days, what we refer to as the cure period, after receipt to remove those defects. Now, if the buyer fails to notify the seller during the 5-day period, then pursuant to the terms set forth in the contract, the buyer then accepts whatever those exceptions are. So if you have never gone over the standard exception A, 1 and 2, homework assignment, really read what that means. So look at those timings. Sometimes you'll say, we're going to close in 10 days. But look at this, the seller has 30 days to cure title. So if there was an issue and the buyer's telling the seller, hey, I see an issue, now the seller has 30 days, you're not going to close in 10 days, are you? So it's really important that you really, really go over those terms and conditions. So Chris, we're going to have a little poll question and they can write their answers into the chat for you. A title insurance commitment should be delivered to the buyer so many days prior to the closing date on the cash transaction. You think it's 15, 5, or 30? Let's see if you were paying attention. So Chris, we have anybody answering the poll?
Yes, we do, quite a few, and everybody is answering with the number 5.
So definition of a title commitment. Okay. So when you send your order to Christopher, but not him personally, right, Chris? Then you'd be really busy getting orders.
That would be. So.
Right. So FAN is going to do one of two things. They're either going to do the search themselves. They are one of the only companies within the state of Florida who do their own searches. Or perhaps they'll send the search to First American and we'll do the search on their behalf, okay? And what comes back then is a title commitment. So the title commitment is the document by which a title insurer discloses to all parties connected with a particular real estate transaction ownership, liens, defects, burdens, and obligations that affect the subject property. Now keep in mind the key word here is anything that is a public record. So if it is a public record, we will find it. If it is not a public record, we will not find it and we will not be obligated. And we're going to talk about some of those issues in a minute. So we got another poll question here, Chris. Which of the following is not a typical title insurance commitment section? So we've got Schedule C, Schedule A, Schedule B1, or Schedule B2.
And most, actually everyone at this point that has responded has put the letter C. So Schedule C is where they feel is not part of it.
And you are all correct. We've got a very smart group this morning, Chris.